Welcome to the Cornerstone Church Podcast, conversations and stories of inspiring faith. On today's episode, our host, Mark Devaney, sits down with Matt and Jennifer Johnson. Matt and Jennifer are our mission partners at Live Global. We hope that as you hear their story, you are encouraged and inspired to pursue the story God is writing in your life. Let's listen in.
Hey, Matt and Jennifer, it's so good to have you on our podcast, and I know that your faith and story is going to inspire so many people. So I'd like to just jump right in and give you the chance to tell us a little bit about you, your family, how long have you been married, any of that type of stuff in that story.
Yeah, well, it's good to be here, and just a pleasure to be able to share a little bit about what God has done in our lives and how faithful and how good He's been, and just to share with your listeners. So thanks for having us. Jen, did you want to share a little bit about our family?
Well, we've been married for 22 years, or it will be in December, and we have 5 children. Our 4 sons are 20, 18, 16, and 14, and then we have a 10-year-old daughter. And we are currently living near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where we're ministering.
Yeah.
That's neat. So 22 years, that's about how long my wife and I have been married. We got married in August of 2000, so that worked out really well.
That
the
is
2000
very nice.
thing.
The
That was
2000
It did,
thing
yes.
is perfect.
So all I have to do is remember what year I'm in, and that's usually how long I've been married. So just got to remember which side of the anniversary
right.
I'm talking about. So 5 kids, that keeps you busy at home.
Yes.
You got a house full at this point, which
Yep.
is very cool. And so tell us a little bit about how the two of you met.
Yeah, so I was 22, 23, living the typical American dream. A house, nice cars, a good job. And one Sunday at a missions conference at our church, the Lord just broke my heart for ministry. I knew that I was supposed to be in ministry. I was a pastor's kid growing up, and my grandfather was a pastor, and I knew from a very early age that I was to be in ministry, but I was running from the Lord, and as I mentioned before, just living that American dream. And the Lord just broke my heart for the need of the world, and so I sold the house, quit the job, and went to Bible school, and that is where I met my wife a couple years later. Jennifer's from California, I'm from Michigan, and the Lord used Bible college to draw us together. Do you want to share a little bit about add anything to that?
Well, by the time we had met, I had graduated from the Bible school, had done another couple years of missions training, had been overseas in Papua New Guinea for a year, and was back on staff at the Bible Institute, and had actually, before he arrived, processed his application because I was working in the admissions office over the summer. Read all of his references, saw his picture, and so I had a lot
transcripts, everything about me.
But I went on. I actually left before he arrived and went on to do some other missions training, and then, due to health reasons, actually came back to the Bible Institute. And so we met after his first year. And that was probably maybe in January, February when we saw each other for the first time. And then we got engaged in May and married in December. So,
Yep.
Yeah.
Pretty quick little whirlwind right there.
Yes, it was.
That's pretty good. Yeah. I actually, same kind of story in terms of the time frame. So my wife and I went on our first date in February of 2000, and we got married in August.
Nice.
So like 6 months.
So,
Yeah.
So it works out really well when
when God brings a good thing into your life, you don't wait.
Yeah, that's right. That's good. So that's really neat. So you're in school. So you've got to finish school at that point,
Yep.
right? You hadn't finished.
Yep.
And so what does that look like? You finish school, then what happened?
The day after graduation, we get married.
Graduation, we got married.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah, and then we went into another year of missions training together, and then what was it? 2 years later, we were in Madrid, Spain, working on a church planting team. So
Okay.
things
So in
happened
between
pretty
that, we
quick.
were in Texas and
Yep. Did some
doing
language study.
So had a baby we were living in Canada
Yeah.
doing training, but he was born in Michigan, went down to Texas, had our second son there, went to Spain, had our third son in Madrid.
Wow.
Kinda,
And so what organization were you with when you
Yeah.
were in Spain?
We were with an organization called ABWE, which stands for Association of Baptists for World Evangelism.
Okay.
And there was a team of about, what would you say, 12, 16 people
Yeah.
there in Madrid, planting churches in the suburbs of Madrid.
Oh, wow.
And we were able to be a part of that for 2.5 years. And just after we were really getting proficient in the language, able to carry on adult conversations, building some great relationships with neighbors and people in our community, Jennifer got sick, pretty much in bed straight for 6 weeks, 3 little ones under the age of 5. And the Lord just made it very clear we needed to go home on a medical furlough. And that was a time where we were asking a lot of questions. And the scripture that just came back to us over and over again is Psalm 18:30. But as for God, his way is perfect. He is a shield to those who take refuge in him. And we just clung to that verse. God's way is perfect. And upon arriving at home, we started ministering in our sending church in Michigan as Jennifer received treatment. And during that year or so of our medical furlough, it became very clear our church was going through huge transitions, and they asked us to stay on staff. And eventually, was it a year after that, they called me to be the senior pastor. And oftentimes we look back at what our church was going through and the timing of all that, and we realized God had a perfect plan in all of this, preparing us for being a part of kind of a church restoration project in the middle of that troubling time that we were going through due to health reasons.
Wow. And that church was in Michigan?
Yes.
It was. And how long did you stay at that church then?
Yeah, so we were there 11 years. That was the church that we got married in, church that sent us out. And so, and the church that I was called into missions from. So that church holds a special place in our hearts and our lives. And it was about halfway through those 11 years that one of my colleagues that I now work with on a daily basis came to our church as a missionary and challenged our church to be involved in a strategic, intentional ministry partnership with a national leader in the island of Trinidad and Tobago, which was a great place to go if you lived in Michigan in January, February, or March.
Those are great trips to take at that point.
So our church agreed and started doing ministry alongside this national leader who was saved and rescued out of this one of the worst areas in terms of crime, drugs in Trinidad. And God marvelously saved him, rescued him, and now he's trying to plant a church back in that same community. And our church got to come alongside him, help him, encourage him in ministry. Every trip we took down there, we were bringing books for him, commentaries, study helps, because he had nothing. And our church just fell in love with this pastor. And even, just for me, I came home after that first meeting and said, this is what I want to do with the rest of my life. And once again, we saw God using the experiences that we had been through, cross-cultural ministry overseas, now pastoral ministry, to prepare us for this new ministry where we're coming alongside national leaders all over the globe and trying to be like a Barnabas of the New Testament, encouraging, equipping, and just supporting them in any way we can in ministry. So it's been neat to see how God has led us.
So you get halfway through that pastorate, you're starting to visit there, your heart's being pricked a little bit in terms of this might be what's next. So how does that next 4, 5, 6 years unfold in the life of the church and get you to that, whatever that next step was that God had for you?
Well, Jennifer, why don't you share your first thoughts as I came home from that trip?
Well, I feel like in the time leading up to then that the Lord had been kind of preparing us for a transition and just putting on our hearts more of a desire to become more directly full-time involved with missions again. So my health had kind of stabilized, and though we hadn't gotten all the answers that we had hoped for, it looks like lupus, that things were still going much, much better than they had been. And so, yeah, Matt had you gone on the trip, or was it just you had heard?
No, I had
talked to them.
I had done one trip.
Okay, he had done a trip. And so I do remember very distinctly him coming into our room and saying, I really believe this is what we should be doing. And I thought, I could see that, but the idea of doing raising support again, the first time we had one little baby.
Yeah.
And this time we had just adopted our daughter. We were fostering a sixth child, another little girl. And the idea of just trying to raise support with such a much larger family seemed pretty daunting. So that was my first thought. Not that I was opposed, but just like, wow, that's going to be something. Yeah. But then also, recognizing how much we've seen God work in the past and ways that we've seen him provide and prove himself strong and faithful, and recognizing if this is what God is calling us to do, then he's going to work those things out for us as well. So. Yeah.
And he gave us plenty of confirmation. About the same time that we were wrestling through some of this, we had a pastor and his wife who actually, Jennifer, grew up in their ministry in California. Yeah. They came to speak at our church, and he had just left the pastoral ministry to do ministry around the globe, just training pastors. That's all he did, is train pastors.
TLI, yeah, Training Leaders International.
And so he challenged our church in the service that day. He said, I challenge you to tithe your pastor, give your pastor a week or two a year to go do theological education, and just really pushed hard on our people to do that. And after the service, I had several people come up to me and say, we think you should do that. Would you be willing to go and do that? And we think this would be great for me. And at first I was like, are they just trying to get rid of me, get me out of the pulpit a couple extra Sundays a year? But as I thought about it, I realized, no, they actually see this in me and see that desire. And they want that for me as well. And so the Lord was just at the same time working in our hearts, but also working in the hearts of our church and providing new leadership at the church so that I could step away and do more of this as we were still walking through what this would look like full time. And so God was once again so good, so kind as he led us through that process.
So when it's time to make the move out of the pastorate into whatever that next step was, what was that process like for you guys to discern what God was doing? We talk a lot in churches about God's will, right? Mm-hmm. So you're trying to discern what God's will is, so to speak, for you guys in this moment. So what was that season like for you, and how did you go about discerning that calling that he was placing on your heart?
Yeah.
Do you want to answer? You're looking at me,
yeah.
But
go for it.
It was not, like, in all honesty, it was not an easy season. Yeah. It really just wasn't. Just being at the church, but then and having some of the same level of responsibilities, but then also recognizing the need to move forward with support raising and preparing for what God had next for us. And so it was difficult, like trying to figure out where boundaries were and where how much time do you spend here and how much time do you spend there. And so that last year, maybe a little bit longer, was not the easiest time.
And I go back to Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, and all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. And so we just kept on praying and looking to God for direction. And one specific prayer request thing that I'll share with you is, for us, we knew our ministry was going to be best accomplished here in North America, living in North America, because we had multiple partners that we were working with in the Caribbean and Latin America and other places around the world, that in order for us to serve all of those partners well, we needed to be here and advocate for them in front of churches and take other churches, pastors over to meet them and develop these relationships with the North American church and these partners. And so the big thing was,
because originally our plan for ministry is not what it is today.
Yeah,
right.
So originally our plan was to work in Latin America and the Caribbean directly with establishing partnerships and working alongside partners there. And so we were considering what would that exactly look like?
Yeah.
Where would we live with our family? Would it be more strategic to be in Atlanta near
a major hub.
Yeah, a major hub for
Right.
airport and like getting to a warmer spot
And not
away
in
from
Michigan.
Michigan had
Right, yeah.
nothing to do with that whatsoever.
I'm sensing a little bit of a trend with Latin American, the Caribbean,
Yeah.
getting out of the
Not
north.
Michigan. I'm from California. It's just-
So we just
we just started
prayed.
praying about, well, what would that look like? Where would we live? And so I told Matthew one evening, I said, I feel like we just need an invitation somewhere. Like if somebody would just put it in front of us and say, hey, would you come to XYZ place, and it would be so much easier. And God did do that. Like within
A couple of weeks, we
was
started
gonna say, it was
praying,
within a
Lord,
week or
invite
two.
us somewhere. And as clear as it could be, we got a phone call, and the guy that I was working under, our executive director at the time, said, I would like you to join our executive team. And in order for you to do that, I need you to move to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And how clear could it be? And so 3.5 years ago, we moved to Pennsylvania. That provided a great transition for our church back in Michigan, for us to easily move away from the church, allowing new leadership to establish, and just gave us a new ministry hub. And it's been wonderful. We love being there, and we're so thankful that God has placed us there.
And so what is this next organization that you're serving with?
So it's still under the umbrella of ABWE,
Okay.
which is the first organization we were with, but we're one of their ministry divisions called Live Global. And so Live Global's main ministry philosophy is coming alongside national leaders in their communities, in their cultural context, and seeking to serve them and encourage them in any way we can. And so as part of the executive team, I'm overseeing a team of missionaries that serves close to 125, 150 national partners in about 50 countries around the world. And
Wow.
so, and once again, we wouldn't have dreamed that we would have this opportunity to see all that God is doing. He's really expanded our scope of ministry, our influence in ministry in ways that we never would have thought of. And so we're so thankful that we just acknowledged him and kept trusting him. And he fulfilled his promise and directed our paths.
That's cool. So you're on staff there 3.5, 4 years ago. Is that
3.5 years ago?
Yeah.
Yeah.
3.5 years ago. So you wind up raising your support.
Yep.
You kind of get through that process. Obviously, you're still probably in the middle of that as
That's
an
true.
ongoing thing
Yeah.
as missionaries,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And so, you're coming alongside of, you're working with missionaries that are, boots on the ground.
Yes.
They're working with national leaders. And then Live Global also seeks to work with churches in the States.
That's
so how does
right.
that work?
That's right. I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah.
We have a two-prong approach to ministry. The first is with those national leaders coming alongside. But then the second aspect of the ministry is coming alongside the North American church and engaging them in ministry, assisting them with their mission strategy, challenging each member of the church by letting each member know you have a role to play in missions. God has gifted you for evangelism. Ephesians 2:10, for we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we would walk in them. And so we're just letting the church, the North American church, know that they have a role to play. And you may be gifted in videography. You may be gifted in, you may be a businessman. Well, you have a role to play. You can come alongside. We're starting business as mission initiatives where we need Christian businessmen who will mentor and disciple and train other Christian businessmen around the world. Sewing ministry. We have partners that have places where we're rescuing women and children out of sex trafficking, and they need an occupation, and sewing can provide them that. The list goes on and on. Sports evangelism. I'm missing some, but there's every believer has a role to play. And
digital techies.
Digital techies, one of our, we just added a full-time software developer to our team who's just helping us write programs and software to help us not only take care of our team and manage our team better, but also help our partners in ministry. So graphic designers, all those things God can use. And so we're coming alongside the North American church and challenging them in that way.
Yeah. So go ahead, Jennifer, you were going to say something.
So I was just going to say, so we've seen this model work really well. Yes, overseas, because we're working with people who already have access to countries and areas that we wouldn't be able to get into as Americans. And we're working with people who already know the language and culture, as a heart language too, and have relationships. Matt mentioned, how we were just getting started after, more than 2 years in Spain, to where we could start really developing relationships. And I think we're working with these partners who have lived in these areas, all their lives and have already developed relationships and these connections and stuff. And so when we just come alongside of them, we're just light years ahead in ministry as far as what we're able to accomplish in partnership together because of that. And then also, in the aspect of the North American church too, what a difference it makes when the North American church, the people in the church can really get involved in missions overseas. It's not just they're writing a check to a missionary that's located somewhere else in the world that they might see every 4 years, but that they're actually getting to establish relationships themselves and build relationships build relationships themselves with the partner that's working overseas. And so, it's been really exciting just to see how that's invigorating to the North American church as well. So it's really hits both areas.
Yeah, it's healthy for the North American church. And I know that you have experienced this in your church.
Yes,
in our church back in Michigan, our people, as they got to know what God was doing in Trinidad and Tobago, as they got to meet these people and get on the ground, soon the people in our church knew more about what was going on in Trinidad and Tobago than I did as the pastor. And they would come up to me on a Sunday morning or throughout the week saying, "Hey, did you hear what's going on there? Did you hear what took place last week? Did you hear that so-and-so got saved last week?" And so that is healthy. And that's what we want for our North American churches. And so the other aspect of that is we take ministry leaders over, pastors and children's ministry workers and lay elders over to do ministry. That really encourages the North American church leadership as well. They get to see what God's doing around the world, and it changes their perspective on ministry. And so we want to do that. We want to encourage the leaders here in North America by what God is doing around the world.
Yeah. So it'd be a good spot to get into this for a moment. So what are the differences that you're seeing in churches? Obviously, you're pretty connected to churches that are overseas through leadership, through relationships with missionaries and those types of things. What are some of the differences that you're seeing between the North American church and churches in the rest of the world?
That is a great question. That's a
Not
good
to put
one.
you on the spot or anything.
That's a good one. I like the question. Wow.
It's probably hard to answer across the board,
Yeah.
right?
It is a very broad question.
Yeah.
Specifically, we could...
Maybe the places that you've been to the most, like if you were
I was thinking either places that you've been or even with this Afghan initiative and the church
so,
in regards to that.
one of my favorite places to travel has been over the past 5-6 years is Cuba, and to see how God is growing the church in Cuba in spite of hardship, in spite of persecution, in spite of government regulations. The church continues to expand and to grow. And I look at even our church that we attend in Pennsylvania, and they want to plan a new church, but this has been in the works 5 years. We still have another year before we launch, and I see how long it's taken us to get to that point. But for Cuba, in Cuba, because of all the different things, all the different factors that are in play there, they're planning churches on an average of 70 a year, and it just happens like overnight. And they're not waiting to make sure that they have their financial house in order to plant a church. They're not waiting to see if they have a core group in that area to plant a church. They're just planting churches when God tells them to plant a church. And so that's encouraging to see. And that's not a knock on how we do things here. I understand that there needs to be a well thought out plan, but that's a huge difference.
It is a big difference.
And you look at it, that's amazing.
Well, it's the paralysis by analysis sometimes, right? Like you don't do anything because you can't quite figure it all out, so to speak. And you're right. I do think that. I mean, I see that with some of the guys that I know that are overseas. Like they'll do things and move at a much quicker pace than sometimes here in the States, because we're trying to make sure we do have all of these things in order. Not to say that that's not necessary sometimes, but sometimes it is like there's a need. Let's go meet it,
And that ties into the next thing that I thought of as well is the vision and the dreams, ministry dreams that these guys and their wives have. Yeah. And, I'll have partners share with me, hey, this is what we feel God calling us to do. And I'm like, okay, I want to pray with you about that. Let's dialogue and let's plan out a little bit, and let's see how we can help. And a month later, it's already going.
They're already doing it.
Yeah, it's already started.
They're doing it.
Yeah.
You're still wanting to pray with them about it. They're doing it.
Right. And so I love that as well. And then I think another aspect of that I see a big difference is we are so well trained and equipped here in North America. And so many of the partners that we work with around the world, just that access for training and equipping is so limited. Yeah. And so, we have pastors in Nepal that have an average of 2 days of training. And 5 years ago, they were practicing Hindus, right? And now they're leading a congregation. And so there's another big difference of just the lack of preparation, the lack of training and equipping, and we want to come alongside and help them in that, so that they're better equipped.
Yeah, wow, it's so different from a cultural standpoint, right? Like these guys, they're coming to faith in Christ, and it's like, all right, let's go, let's roll through this, and you got to go to Bible school, and you got, you give away 3 or 5 years of your life. And they're like, but wait a minute, what are we going to do back home? Right. But it's really interesting to see the difference in there. That is a tough question, but I hear of things that are going on, and you do, like Cuba as an example. You've shared with me some of the stuff from Cuba. And, here they are in such an oppressive area, and the things that they're going through, and how hard life is, right? But yet the church is moving, and the church is growing and flourishing. Not like we would look at it from a North American U.S. standpoint, but in God's eyes, man, the church is accomplishing great things in those places, which is really cool. That's neat. So tell me a little bit about, like, with your life and ministry today, like what does that day-to-day stuff look like? Yeah. Or week to week even.
So 3 years ago when we moved to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, our team existed of about 30 North Americans serving partners around the globe. In three and a half years, our team is now up to 100. Okay. And so we've expanded greatly. The Lord, in the midst of COVID, just brought more and more people who wanted to serve full time with their gifts to our team. And so a lot of my day-to-day ministry involves equipping and helping and onboarding new missionaries. And so I don't travel overseas alone anymore. It's always with someone new that's joined our team. They're coming alongside, and I'm thinking with them how this ministry partner that we're visiting, how they could be the long-term relationship builder for that partner. So it's a lot of onboarding with new missionaries, a lot of coaching, and in a lot of ways, I feel like my pastoral ministry has prepared me for that, because I feel like I'm becoming a pastor to missionaries.
Okay, yeah.
And so that's a huge part. With a growing team, there's structure that needs to be put in place. There's, we need to make sure we're in a good spot in terms of what are our core values, what kind of people are we recruiting to join our team. A lot of that strategy stuff, I spend a lot of time working with the other executive directors on that. And then, let's see, I think probably on average, I'm traveling 6, 7, 8 times a year overseas. And then there's the domestic travel, speaking in churches, connecting with churches or universities. I was at a university last month, speaking to their business students and encouraging them to use their skills that God has given them to serve partners around the world in terms of creating business initiatives. So that's a little bit of my day-to-day. Can you add anything to that, babe?
I think that probably covers it pretty well. I mean, there is the aspect too of relationship with our national partners, with multiple national partners, and meeting with them either in person or Zoom, or and still doing some of that training with them as well has still been a
I think for our family, we probably have 3, 4 national partners that we kind of feel like we quote unquote own or are in charge of, or we're the main connection to. And so that's another aspect of just providing care, advocacy for them as well.
Yeah. So looking at, like, as you guys move forward, let's first talk about Live Global, because it seems like some of the stuff you're doing is Live Global kind of a newer part of the ABWE? Like, how long has it been around? Because it seems like you guys are still developing some of that core values, and obviously it's growing pretty rapidly if you've added so many folks so quickly. So
Live Global is new in that we didn't exist as an organization 3 years ago, but we basically the ministry philosophy has been around for 35 years under the ABWE umbrella. It was just under a different name called GAP, Global Access Partnerships. And basically GAP got started going into places where North Americans couldn't go. The only option was to take up the national leaders and equip them and train them and help them in ministry. And so that started 35 years ago. And that ministry philosophy of working alongside those national leaders worked so well, was so effective, that we began doing that in places that we could go. Jamaica, Trinidad, Tobago, and other places around the world. And so the problem with GAP is there was no way that we could expand the ministry in terms of digital engagement, branding, because everyone sees the name GAP and they think a clothing store. So Live Global became the new name, the new face of that ministry, and new leadership, younger leadership, and with that, just a new younger generation of missionaries coming to join our team. And because of that, it was essential that we kind of think of ourselves as a startup ministry and lay those key foundational blocks of what are our core values. What is our ministry philosophy, and just making sure we're all on the same page so that there's room for us to expand and grow and serve. And so that's been a lot of what we've been involved in the past 3 years.
So part of what you've been doing has been developing this.
Yep.
What does this new thing look like? Even though you're taking an old model that was a part of ABWE, but you're bringing it into just kind of this new frontier, so to speak.
Yeah.
Which is really cool. So tell us for a minute. You've shared with me about the Afghan initiative.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that? It's been mentioned one time here. So tell us what's going on with that.
Yeah. So back in January of this year, 2022, we were introduced by an immigration attorney who's a believer to 40 Christian Afghan families who had been chased out of Afghanistan by the Taliban and were living in a refugee camp in the Middle East. And she had been in the process of vetting them, getting to know them, and trying to find a way to bring them to the States. And she came to us as an organization and said, would you ever consider bringing these Afghan church leaders into the U.S. as missionaries to plant churches among Afghan peoples here? There's close to 200,000 Afghans here in the U.S., and the number is growing. And so back in January, we started praying and thinking through this. It took ABWE is a 95-year-old organization. And so this was a big ask for our organization to consider. We're used to sending people out. And now we're asking ABWE, would you be willing to bring missionaries in? And so for the next couple months, just a lot of dialogue, a lot of praying that went into this. And we began holding interviews with some of these leaders, Afghan leaders, and we narrowed the list down to 11 family units. And we captured their stories. We did doctrinal interviews with them. We made sure that the U.S. government had done all the proper vetting of them. And eventually our organization, Live Global and ABWE, agreed to bring on these 11 families into the U.S. We submitted their religious visa paperwork, and we just waited and waited and waited. Yeah. It took forever for the documents and for the paperwork to get through. There was like 3 branches of the U.S. government that this paperwork had to get through.
And in the meantime, these families are in the refugee camp, continuing to do ministry within the refugee camp, and still not out of danger, because many of them had been beaten, imprisoned, even shot at by the Taliban, and had death threats on their death threats against them. And but they continued to minister even within the camp. And some of them were still receiving threats within the camp, and now they have no way to go, nowhere to hide,
right.
nowhere to go. And so still getting death threats. One of them was beaten within the camp. And so, and then they had already been through so much trauma already anyways. And just our desire to get them out as quickly as possible and established here in the U.S. Yeah. And so it was difficult for everybody, this waiting period, and again reminding ourselves, as for God, His way and His timing are perfect. Yeah.
So in that process, we picked 3 strategic locations here in the U.S. and our criteria for that was, first, there had to be an Afghan population. And then second, we had to have ABWE or Live Global missionaries on the ground working in those areas as well, to receive these Afghan leaders and to help begin that church planting movement there. And then third, an anchor church that would be willing to kind of host them, to provide care teams for the Afghans. And so we don't publicly share where those places are. We have one here in the South, another place out west, or 2 places out west, where we've started to relocate these Afghans. So now we have, out of the 11 units, we have 6 on the ground already. The other 5, because of situations in the camp, the other 5 got sent to Canada because we weren't able to get their visa paperwork back in time. And we're still in dialogue right now with them, figuring out, are we going to bring them to the States to be a part of our teams, or does God actually want you to be there in in Canada. It's interesting. Many of them were sent to Vancouver, and based upon the numbers that we have of who were Christians and which ones were Christian leaders or not, and who got sent to Canada, we believe that Vancouver could have one of the largest Afghan churches in the world. And so we're praying and wondering if God wants us to pivot here and see if God has a special plan for Vancouver. So
some call it coincidence.
Yeah. So,
some call it providence.
That's right. That's right. So all the families that are here in the U.S. arrived within the past month.
Wow.
And so they're in the process of getting their Social Security numbers, learning, getting their driver's permits, getting their kids enrolled in school. And at the same time, they're already ministering.
Yeah.
And within a week, one couple, within a week of arriving, had an opportunity to speak to 30 Afghans.
Wow.
And share their testimony of faith in Jesus. And that, for you and me, it'd taken us 3-4 years to be able to do that if we were really working hard at the language and trying to understand culture and stuff. But for them, within a week, they're able to go at it.
That's
and
cool.
So we're super excited about how God's working in this.
That's neat. So I want to give you a chance, 2 things real quick. One is share with us like a big God story of things that are going on. Obviously, the Afghan initiative would be one that's going on, but maybe just even in your life and ministry, like how have you seen God move and provide, or just a big God story that you can share with folks?
Yeah.
It's hard to think of just one. It seems like any time there's been a transition, going to Spain, coming back from Spain, just seeing God provide and care for us. And when we were coming back, it was very difficult to come back. It was because we had worked so hard and so long, to get there. And even getting our driver's license in Spain was very difficult. I mean, when you think like you put all of this into it, and then to have it kind of disappear, and it didn't work out, and to think, God, what are you doing, with this? Because you don't see it, you don't know. So. And I remember thinking there in Spain, lying in bed at night thinking, are we going to continue to have ministry? God, are you going to allow us to continue to serve you? I want to be able to continue to serve you full time, but I had no idea what was that going to look like, or were we going to be able to do that? And just to see, those kinds of things that God just walks you through those things. And obviously, yes, God has allowed us to continue to serve full time. And looking back now and seeing at that time, and there are a lot of, it is a very long story, all the things that went on during that time. But looking at all of those things, and just even seeing this one dynamic of how God used that time overseas, used Matt's experience in pastoring, and combined all of those things together for what we're doing now. And I think even some of the processes that we went through in that to grow us in our faith, and to whenever God answers prayer and you see him providing and giving comfort, then you can use that in ministry with other people. So sometimes even just walking through those things and seeing God's faithfulness equips you to better serve other people. And so, and just seeing how God brought all of that together to bring us where we are now. And we're not at an end point now, but I guess for me, it wouldn't be one big aha moment so much as just the steadfastness and the faithfulness and the care and love and provision and goodness that we've seen in God and the way that he has cared for us just over and over and over and over again throughout the years. But yeah, those transition times, I think are ones where you see that more clearly, right? I mean, any time when you have when you feel your need more, whether it's because of health or finances or relationships or changes and in those things that that causes us to turn more to God and cast ourselves on him. And in those times, I think we see him more clearly.
That's good. And I would, a specific area tied into what Jennifer was saying is, and it's not so much a aha or big God moment as much as God's continued faithfulness to bring certain kinds of people into our lives. And just so thankful for the body of Christ. And I'll just, was it 3 years ago, I get this weird email saying, I've been watching you. Yeah. And it was Mark. And just that came at the exact moment that we needed it. We needed to hear that there was this pastor in South Carolina that was following us, interested in us and wanting to get to know us, and what encouragement that has been. And just over the years to see how God brings certain people into our lives that you look back and say, I don't know if our ministry, if our lives would be the same if it wasn't for that person. And so that's just another example of God's goodness to us, God's faithfulness, but also an example of how we need each other, that gospel ministry is not meant to be done alone, that we're meant to be doing that, linking arms with other believers and going into battle together for the sake of the gospel around the world. So
it's interesting because people that are listening, you may not know this, but Matt and I are cousins. And so when I sent him that email, he and I had talked a couple of times through the years when you were pastoring that church. I know we had corresponded a few times just as you were leading through some transition, and I had led through some transition here at Cornerstone. But to see, I did start watching. I don't even remember why, but I started paying attention to what you were doing as you made that move to live global. And so it has been fun to see it. And you and I have talked even more through the last 3 years, had some phone calls together. But it's so interesting to see you talk about God's faithfulness. And I'm sitting here as you're sharing, Jennifer, I'm thinking we just finished a series at Cornerstone on Joseph. And so while somebody didn't do something to you, meaning it for evil, God has used all of those seasons that you were in really to really prepare you for what this is that you're currently doing. And it's just a really great work to see. And I know the times that we talk and you share with me some of that stuff. The Afghan Initiative was one that we've talked about earlier this year. And I just thought that was so cool to hear about, knowing like, hey, look at what's happening around the world. And I think that's just a big part of what the North American church needs to hear more of. Like, this is the stuff that's happening around the world.
That's right.
So I want to give you one chance real quick, just as we wrap up our time. Like, what would you say to people that are trying to figure out what do I do to live life purposefully? Like, what would you say to try to inspire them to use the gifts and strengths and talents, whatever it is, to be used for kingdom purposes?
Well, I would just encourage them by reminding them from the beginning of time, God's desires that the world be filled with worshipers. And we see that in Genesis chapter 12, that all the nations will come to know Jesus. You see it in the Psalms. Let the nations be glad and sing for joy. The prophets talk about how there will come a day where the knowledge of the glory of the Lord will fill the earth as the waters cover the sea. My name will be great among the nations in Malachi. And so just being reminded that is God's intention, that is God's purpose, that's the direction we're headed. Revelation says that there will come a time where there will be people from every tribe, tongue, and nation worshiping around the throne. And so my encouragement would be, remember that that's where we're headed. And remember that God has created you for a specific purpose to be a part of that. and that you can worship God with your obedience, that you can worship God with your skills, your gifts. I've already mentioned Ephesians 2:10. You are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works. And so just use the gifts, the skills that God has given you. Use your resources. Use your education. Use your hobby. Or your likes, or just something that you enjoy doing, and find a way to use that for the sake of the gospel, and just lay it out there for the Lord to use, and He will use you.
Yeah, that's good. Jennifer, any thoughts?
I agree. And I would just say too, that God calls us. God doesn't call us to do great things for Him, right? God calls us to be faithful and to be obedient.
That's good.
And it's going to look different for every person.
Yes.
And some people it will be going overseas, and some people it won't, right? But we're going to look for opportunities, whatever opportunities that God puts before us, to witness to our neighbor, to be faithful, to teach our children scripture. Whatever area it is that God has called us to, we want to be faithful and obedient in that area. Yeah. And it may not always look like a big change. We've had some big changes in our lives, but every person, God has a different plan for, and it looks different for each person. But I think that as we look back and remember, turn our eyes to the cross, and remember the gospel and what God has accomplished for us, and who we are in Him, and then looking forward to our hope and our future, and that looking back and what God has done and looking forward to what we have to look forward to, I think are things too that help to encourage us in faithfulness for today.
That's good. That's good. Well, thank you guys so much for your time. It's been great to hear a little bit of your story, and personally to be inspired by what God's doing in and through you.
Oh, praise the Lord. We're so glad that we could do this with you, and it's a great privilege for us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.